I feel like I've done a disservice to people who always constantly ask me, where should I start with Stephen King? And I say different seasons because it doesn't really have anything scary. So if you're not into the horror stuff, you might be able to get into it because it's not scary. And then I remembered, you know what though? Apt Pupil might be the most disturbing thing that I've ever read. Let's take a look at different seasons. The most important things are the hardest to say. They are the things you get ashamed of because words make them smaller. When they were in your head, they were limitless, but once they come out, they seem to be no bigger than normal things. But that's not all. The most important things lie too close to wherever your secret heart is buried. They are clues that could guide your enemies to a prize they would love to steal. It's hard and painful for you to talk about these things, and then people just look at you strangely. They haven't understood what you've said at all, or why you almost cried while you were saying it. Love isn't soft like those poets say. Love has teeth, which bite, and the wounds never close. I want to hear about it, that's all. That's all they want, really. The firing squads, the gas chambers, the ovens, the guys who had to dig their own graves and then stand on the end so they'd fall into them, the examinations, the experiments, everything. All the gushy stuff. You are the monster. Homesickness is not always a vague, nostalgic, almost beautiful emotion, although that is somehow the way we always seem to picture it in our mind. It can be a terribly keen blade, not just a sickness in metaphor, but in fact as well. It can change the way one looks at the world. The faces one sees in the street look not just different, but ugly, perhaps even malignant. Homesickness is a real sickness, the ache of the uprooted plant. Yes, some birds are just not meant to be caged, that's all. Their feathers are too bright, their songs too sweet and wild. So you let them go, or when you open the cage to feed them, they somehow fly out past you. And part of you knows that it was wrong to imprison them in the first place. But still, the place where you live is that much more drab and empty for their departure. Always remember that hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. It always comes down to just two choices: get busy living or get busy dying. Hey, what's up, bookworms and constant readers? Mike back with part 2 of the different seasons review, and today we're going to be talking about the second entry in that story, Apt Pupil. Now guys, this is one that a lot of people got really familiar with when the movie came out in the 90s. Well, I'm just going to tell you that movie, it was okay. This book, it is brilliant. Its story, I guess, in this book is brilliant. And I'm going to talk about it here. If you don't know, I'm doing one video each for each story within different seasons. I did my Shawshank one last week. You can check that one out here. This one's going to be for the season of summer. And the summer of corruption is Apt Pupil. So I'm just going to get right into it here by talking about what is it about. And we got to talk about Todd Bowden, because you're going to remember that name. So Todd Bowden is an apt pupil. Good grades, good family, a paper route, and while learning about the Holocaust at school, he becomes obsessed with the whole topic and eventually discovers that German immigrant Arthur Denker is actually named Curtis Doosander, a wanted war criminal. Todd knows all about Doosander's dark past, the torture, the death, the decades-old manhunt Doosander has escaped from to this day. Yet Todd does not want to turn him in. Todd wants to know more, much more. He's about to learn the real meaning of power and about the seductive lure of evil. Guys, that is about as close as you can get without actually spoiling the story. Like I said, I don't feel like I'm ruining anything there, because if you know anything about this, you understand what the whole concept behind it is. But trust me, there's so much more, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Non-spoiler, don't worry about it. Let's talk about what makes it good or bad. Let's start with the good. I always like to start with the good first. I think because it touches on a topic that's always going to be sensitive, right? I mean, we're 80 years removed from this event, but it still doesn't feel like, it feels like it's too soon whenever you talk about it. And that, of course, is the genocide commit by Hitler's Third Reich Nazi regime that murdered 6 million people. So this is obviously something that you feel like, yeah, I could see Stephen King writing about that because it's pretty messed up, right? And Stephen King likes to write about messed up stuff. Now, like I said, I always know I tell people, there are different seasons is good because, it's a good entryway. If you're not into horror stuff, I think you'll be fine. This isn't precisely horror, but it is very, very dark and disturbing content. And obviously, if you're dealing with the Holocaust, the fallout in the years after that, obviously, this story takes place just about, 35 years after the Holocaust. So it's really still kind of fresh in the mind's eye of that time. Now, unlike Shawshank, which felt very kind of out of the norm for the whole master of horror, this feels a little bit more like him. Yes, there's nothing supernatural going on with this one, but I feel like it goes to maybe even darker places that he wouldn't go to until they got to like Pet Sematary a few years later. But it also just feels like the kind of thing that no author would have touched back in 1982 except a Stephen King. He had built up enough clout at that point. I feel like he could talk about some of this stuff and make a work of fiction out of it based off of real events that could make it actually kind of terrifying. And still one of the scariest stories in my opinion, because it's more of in a more human way than his supernatural tales, because it deals very much with the reality that was, the evils of Nazism and the whole corruption of the young kind of thing, and thinking about what happens when you give a impressionable young man access to an escaped Nazi. It's one of those things where you think the whole book you're wondering, well, maybe Doosander is reformed. He has, he's has regret for what he's done over the last few years or whatever. And it's just one of those things where you start wondering about midway through the story, well, geez, which one of these guys is a bigger monster, right? And it's just, it develops all those themes that I think that you would be looking for in what I say is Stephen King's best trait, is that he is the master of the coming of age story. This takes place over 4 years, so it's very much a coming of age story, but pretty much in like the opposite way of most of his stuff. It's usually his coming of age story is them dealing with some kind of scary supernatural monster and overcoming that, right? This is very much, I'd say, kind of like a reverse version of Stand By Me, except it's just one kid instead of 4, which we'll be talking about The Body next week. I say Stand By Me because more people recognize it that way. I mean, obviously, it's The Body. I just want to say that the cat scene in this is one of the most disturbing things I have ever read from Stephen King. It's more disturbing than anything in it. It's more disturbing than anything in Pet Sematary. It is messed up. And that's all I'll say about it, because I don't want to completely spoil it for you. I think the really dark part of this is that what starts out as just curiosity for Todd becomes a struggle for his very soul. And it's at a point where it's like, well, where do you stop? Why are you doing some of these things you're doing? And he just keeps going darker and darker and darker. And you wonder, is there a point of no return for this kid? I mean, I'd argue after the first really, really heinous act that he does, that he's already past the point of no return. But up until the last pages of this book, you're wondering, is it too late for him to turn this around, or is he just too far gone? So yes, it is very much a descent into darkness from the eyes of a young man that I felt like we hadn't gotten from any really popular authors at that time. To just really the levels of darkness that Todd goes to in this is just like, definitely know you're reading a Stephen King story, right? As far as a couple of bad things, I'm not really sure that Todd was ever really innocent. I mean, he was kind of dark from the get-go. It seemed just like a kind of a morbid curiosity with him at first. But while I'm reading, I'm kind of like, I mean, maybe it's just me at that age. I couldn't relate to that. I mean, sure, I was always interested in history. I mean, I always felt weird being interested in like serial killers and stuff. It didn't mean I wanted to hang out with one. I always was interested in researching like the history behind them and how they, were able to keep these kinds of things secret and stuff like that. But it was never because I wanted to, emulate this this whole thing. But with Todd, it's just like, I feel like he's to a point of almost sickening with his obsession over the Holocaust and just how much he wants to know the real details, the stuff that they wouldn't tell him in the history books, as he puts it. It's like this kid's messed up already. I was like, I bet he's the kind of kid who probably like, hurt animals and stuff, and like used to like get a kick out of like crushing bugs, because I feel like he's very dark from the get-go. So I don't know if it's really hugely surprising the way that the story goes, because this kid is jacked up from the beginning, I think. So his relationship with his parents, just watching that fall apart, is just like soul crushing reading this now as an adult with young kids. It's sinister stuff. So I won't really say that's a bad. I would say it's not so good. It's just because it's kind of like, to me, it feels almost like the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining, where Jack feels insane from the go. There is no descent into madness. I almost feel like this is kind of King writing it that way, where Todd's already feels like a bad egg, and I feel like, yeah, he's got good grades and stuff, but he doesn't feel like he's right in the head, and this is just like bad going worse, So another one, I don't consider this bad, but for whatever reason, some people thought that this would have a happy ending. It doesn't. It's one of his absolutely darkest endings, I think, even over Cujo. But I don't think that brings it down. I think it's just got to a point where people feel like they have to criticize Stephen King's ending so much. I mean, if you read this story, pretty much from the midway point, you're pretty sure this isn't having a happy ending, right? So I don't know what you're looking for there. I feel like with King's endings, if it's a happy ending, oh, it's just way too Disney. If it's a bad ending, oh, it's way too morbid. If it's ambiguous, oh, there's King dropping the ball again. So I just think he's got a reputation at this point that, oh, he can't write an ending because people didn't like a couple of endings that he wrote. I think that's the biggest. The only thing that's a bigger myth than that is the whole how he feels about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining thing. But I talked about that in the Shining review, in case you missed it. Let's get into why you should read it. Look, I avoid politics all the time on this channel. I don't really think that this kind of goes into politics, but it does kind of go into some things that are relevant today. And I apologize for that, but I do feel like it's relevant to talk about why I think people should read this book. I feel like people need to understand why throwing the word Nazi out there as an insult needs to be checked just a little bit. Look, I've been called a Nazi for simply saying I love a book that's been banned, okay? I wasn't burning it at the time, but I've gotten called that for simple things like that. And people need to read this and realize the weight behind a word like that, and realize, the descendants of, the families that were raped and tortured and gassed and murdered. I don't think that they appreciate people throwing that out like you would calling someone an idiot. I really don't think that calling someone a Nazi because they disagree about a movie makes a lot of sense. But for me, it's I'm always one of those, hey, free speech, you want to treat someone like crap, that's your point of view. I like to be positive, but I feel like it's the same as using the word rape really lightly, like saying, oh, I totally raped you, dude, while playing a video game. Calling someone a Nazi because they have a difference of opinion in you, that I think is just absolutely absurd and over the top and uncalled for, honestly. So I feel like people should read this story and kind of see the implications of what real Nazis did. Yes, because it is very graphic. It is very to the point. And it's, if you're one of those people that's like, oh, I couldn't read that because it made me uncomfortable. That's what horror is. It makes you uncomfortable. So I think people need to read that. So very, very relevant, I think. I think it's also King in a way that you haven't read before. It shows that sometimes the biggest monsters aren't the monsters. They're the humans and the monstrous things that humans do to one another. That's a theme in most of his books, honestly, especially his ones with his big monsters, is that humans are the biggest monsters. And in this, it shows that, humans are the biggest monsters, and the biggest monster might not be the one that you think it is. So, I think that it's every bit a kind of a story that I think people need to read. And I've constantly heard people talk about, oh yeah, I got that to read Shawshank and The Body, and I didn't read the other two. I think that's foolish. This is a very important book. It is, again, King in his heyday, really kicking ass. And yes, it's uncomfortable to read, but that's what makes King, right? So let's talk about a couple of final thoughts here. I think that it really is Apt Pupil is kind of gripping in a way that you wouldn't expect. I feel like this was just King, kind of spreading his literary wings at this point and being able to talk about things that other people didn't want to talk about and not having to have a big, scary, supernatural monster in his story. And I think the story is better for that because he breaks down some of the darkness within the human psyche like I haven't seen before. It's just, it's good stuff. It's really good stuff. Very, very high recommend. I gave it this one story, I did rank all 4 of these by themselves. I gave it a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads, which is just about as high as I'm going to give most cases. It is phenomenal. And I think that, like I said, not only is it relevant and important for people to read today, it's just a damn good yarn. And I think you'd really, really enjoy it. Now, there aren't very many multiverse connections, much like last week when I told you with Shawshank, which mostly it was just like this. So I'll start with Shawshank Redemption. Andy Dufresne is the one who set up Kurt Dusanders' stock portfolio. He even mentions Andy by name a couple of times because he says that his name reminds him of his alias, Arthur Danker, Andy Dufresne. So just nice little call. But again, not that much. It was the story right after it. So it's not like it was a long ways away or something like that. Like some of his other ones feel like that's like, wow, he wrote that book 15 years ago. Interesting tie-in. Then you got The Shining here, and the headmaster in Jack Torrance's play that he was writing in that book was named Danker. And then you got Todd's guidance counselor, Mr. French. He is staying at room 217 in the hotel. So, I mean, light connection, I guess. I mean, every time you get 217, 2 plus 17 equals 19. Those kind of things, we're going to kind of bring them up. Also, Night Shift. Night Shift, Strawberry Spring, a story in there. Dusander does mention Spring Hill Jack. That is the serial killer from New England that is talked about in that story. And that really is it for the connections this go around. I think that the Multiverse Connections are going to kind of be the lightest in this novella collection, just because it really feels like he was doing something a little different. He had just done Dark Tower before this, so he was probably kind of being like, okay, I'm going to calm down a little bit with the connections. But there's a few there that make it feel like it's not too heavy-handed. Again, what I like about his multiverse is it feels cohesive. It doesn't feel forced. Like he's like, okay, I got to get 4 mentions within my universe in this book. It never really feels like that. I don't think that they ever feel out of place. So they're there if you're looking for them. If you're not looking for them, it won't change the story for you very much at all. And guys, that is Apt Pupil. Again, I think it's a phenomenal read. I think everyone needs to check it out. So again, Different Seasons is going to be the book I'm going to keep recommending to you if you haven't read Stephen King yet. So we'll check out next week. We'll be talking about The Body, the ultimate coming of age story. So I'll hit you guys then and talk to you there.